August 6, 1944. Dawn. A secret airfield near Tours occupied France. The air was thick not just with the summer humidity, but with the suffocating smell of high-octane fuel and ozone. Low clouds hung over the tree line, a grey, silent witness to the war's slow, agonizing turn. Below, concealed beneath camouflage netting that did little to hide the immense scale of their undertaking, sat a machine that was less an aircraft and more a prophecy of doom. It was an engineering monstrosity, a Junkers Ju-88 bomber, stripped of its cockpit and forward fuselage, replaced instead by a massive high-explosive warhead, over 1,800 kilograms of unstable compound. Perched directly above it, like a parasite fused to its host, was a diminutive Messerschmitt Bf-109G fighter. Two distinct aircraft, locked in an unholy, asymmetric embrace. This was the Mistel, the mistletoe, a kiss of death from a dying Reich. The official designation was a composite aircraft. The pilots, however, used a more honest term, the Death Pact. We have entered the final act of the European air war. The tide of steel, fuel, and pilot skill had turned decisively against the Luftwaffe. Yet desperation breeds ingenuity, and sometimes madness. The strategic aim of the Mistel was simple yet audacious: turn a standard bomber into a giant, precision-guided missile. The pilot in the upper 109 would navigate the pair to the target, perhaps a vital bridgehead on the Seine, a hydroelectric dam, or a port facility, and then, at the last possible moment, detach and guide the lower, explosive-laden Ju-88 into the target. This was a one-way trip for the Ju-88, and as the pilots knew with chilling clarity, a highly perilous, often suicidal trip for themselves. The crew was drawn from Kampfgeschwader 200, KG 200, the elite unit tasked with the Luftwaffe's most secret, bizarre, and high-risk operations. These men were volunteers, but unlike the famous fanatical kamikaze pilots of the Pacific, their motivation was complex, a blend of fanaticism, technological faith, and a desperate, almost academic desire to strike a blow when all seemed lost. One pilot, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Lange, a veteran from the brutal Eastern Front, captured the unit's fatalistic spirit in a letter home. "They call us suicide pilots in the mess hall, but we are not seeking death, only effectiveness. The technology is sound, the payload is certain. If the devil demands my return flight as payment for sinking that bridge, it is a price I will pay for the Reich." The core irony of the Mistel program lies in its inherent contradiction. German engineering prided itself on precision, on safe return, on the perfection of the machine. The Mistel, however, was a weapon of waste, of finality, and of human expendability. It was a technological answer to a purely strategic question. How do we inflict maximum pain with minimum resources when air superiority is lost? This was the ultimate high-stakes gamble. The operational ceiling of the Mistel pair was restricted, its speed sluggish, and its maneuverability near zero. It was an enormous, slow-moving target, requiring absolute secrecy and perfect weather. Any encounter with the omnipresent Allied fighter sweeps meant almost certain destruction. The plan for this dawn sortie: target the critical Pont de la Roche-Guyon on the Seine, a bottleneck choking the Allied advance toward Paris. A handful of these composite beasts were prepared, each crew performing their final checks, the upper pilot staring down at the massive blunt nose of the explosive he was tethered to. The sound of the coupled engines starting up was not the usual roar of Teutonic power, but a strained, heavy groan, the sound of two unwilling partners being dragged into the sky. But what the engineers, the strategists, and Oberleutnant Lange did not fully grasp was the new, terrifying evolution of their adversary. As the Mistel crews were preparing their final, desperate thrust, a new breed of killer was staking its claim to the European skies: the P-51 Mustang, flown by pilots who were no longer just interceptors, but hunters. And among them, one group stood out for its lethality, its score count, and its chilling insignia: a skull crowned with a sickle, draped over a scythe. They were the 352nd Fighter Group. To the bewildered, terrified remnants of the Luftwaffe, they were known simply as the Grim Reapers. The story of the Mistel and the grim fate awaiting its crews is one of the most forgotten, yet most revealing episodes of the air war. If you want to dive deeper into the hidden technologies and human drama of World War II, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these untold stories to light. The Second World War was, at its core, a contest of industrial scale and technological escalation. By late 1944, the balance had shifted drastically. The United States was producing aircraft at a staggering rate that dwarfed the combined output of the Axis powers. Consider the numbers. In 1944 alone, the US produced nearly 96,000 aircraft. Germany, facing constant strategic bombing, managed only about $40,000, and many of those were trainers or less effective types. This sheer industrial weight meant that the Luftwaffe was constantly outnumbered, outgunned, and facing pilots with increasing combat hours and confidence. The Mistral was born from this abyss. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a desperate philosophical statement. If Germany could not afford the fuel and resources for full bomber fleets, they would turn existing, obsolete frames into giant, unmanned guided bombs. The technology behind the Mistral was a marvel of destructive ingenuity. The explosive used in the Ju-88's nose section was often trilene, a highly potent mix of RDX, TNT, and aluminum powder designed for maximum blast and thermal effect. The physics of the system demanded an intricate coupling mechanism, a rigid strut assembly connecting the two aircraft, incorporating complex electrical and pneumatic lines. The critical phase was the detachment. At the moment of release, the pilot in the upper Bf-109 had to simultaneously fire explosive bolts to separate the units and activate the Ju-88's automatic flight controls, which were programmed to maintain a straight, stable flight path for the final few kilometers. The entire process, from initiation to the 109 pilot braking hard away, took barely 3 seconds. Any malfunction, any hesitation, and the $1 8-ton warhead would detonate, taking both aircraft and crew with it. The psychological impact on the German pilot was immense. Unlike conventional bombing runs where the crew could return to base, the Mistral pilot was required to fly nose-to-nose with his explosive charge for hours. He was essentially riding a massive, slow-moving bomb, knowing that his target was not just a point on a map, but the physical destruction of the enemy's critical infrastructure, likely at the cost of his own life if the escape maneuver failed, or if he encountered enemy fighters in his now underpowered lone Messerschmitt. This feeling of riding the line between life and absolute destruction was echoed in the diary entries of Mistral pilots. Hauptmann Klaus Richter wrote, "The sound of the engines is never synchronized. It is a constant shuddering disagreement between the two wings, a struggle for control. You feel the weight of the warhead beneath you, the mass of it. It is the physical manifestation of our final desperate hope. You are flying a technical miracle, yet you feel like a man standing on the tip of a lightning rod during a storm." While the Germans gambled on technological suicide, the Allies, specifically the USAAF, had mastered high-altitude, long-range escort. Their technological spearhead was the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang, particularly the P-51D variant, with the powerful Packard Merlin V1650 engine, had transformed the air war. Its range, capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and its speed over $700 ext, made it the perfect hunter. It was sleek, fast, and devastatingly armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns, capable of firing a total of 150 rounds per second. The most terrifying exponent of the Mustang's dominance was the 352nd Fighter Group, based at Bodney, England. Their nickname, the Grim Reapers, wasn't self-appointed. It was earned in blood and fire. By late 1944, this unit had established a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Their pilots were not just defensive escorts. They specialized in deep penetration Jabo, fighter bomber, and Rambler missions, sweeping ahead of the bomber streams to engage the Luftwaffe where it lived, its airfields. While the Mistral crew trained in their dark, isolated corner of France, believing their secret weapon would achieve a crippling surprise, the Grim Reapers were honing their craft, aggressive, low-altitude hunting tactics that specialized in catching slow, vulnerable prey during takeoff and landing. The stage was set for a collision, the German technological gamble of desperation versus the American mastery of long-range industrial air dominance. The Mistral pilots had trained for a suicidal dive on a bridge, What they were about to face was a far more terrifying enemy than they had ever prepared for. The 352nd Fighter Group was an anomaly, a unit that transitioned from the robust but slower Republic P-47 Thunderbolt to the sleek P-51 Mustang, and never looked back. Their commander, Colonel John C. Meyer, instilled a culture of aggressive pursuit. Their motto was simple: find them high, follow them low, and don't come home until your guns are empty. For the Mistral crews, the concept of a long-range fighter sweeping their airfields was a psychological terror. They were used to facing the occasional bomber, but the relentless presence of the P-51 changed everything. It felt, as one German veteran put it, like trying to sneak through a field covered by thousands of armed American farmers. The Allied operational intelligence regarding the Mistral was surprisingly good, aided by the sheer number of recon flights and captured documents. They knew a large, unusual, composite aircraft existed. They just didn't know its exact purpose or operational ceiling. This uncertainty added fuel to the Grim Reaper's resolve. They were searching for a phantom weapon, and they were prepared to kill everything slow and high value they found. On the morning of the Mistral sortie toward the Seine, the 352nd was flying a ramrod mission, escort for a heavy bomber stream targeting rail yards deep inside Germany. But the key to the Reaper's success was their discipline for the breakaway. Once the bombers were safely past the most dangerous zone, the P-51s were authorized to hunt targets of opportunity. This transition from escort to hunter was where the German pilot's terror began. Major George E. Preddy, the group's leading ace, was flying the lead element of the breakaway sweep. Preddy was a legend, known for his almost uncanny ability to spot enemy aircraft at incredible distances. He had already achieved ace-in-a-day status and approached combat with a cold, almost detached focus. To him, the Luftwaffe was less an enemy and more a mathematical problem to be solved with speed, vector, and 6 machine guns. In a captured letter, a young German pilot recently transferred to the Mistelstaffel wrote of the American aces, "The American pilots do not fly like us. We fight like duelists. Honor, skill, the turn, the dive. They fly like Grim Reapers. They do not care about the dance, they only care about the harvest. Their P-51s appear out of the sun and are gone before you hear the gunfire. They leave only smoke." This fear was about to become horrifyingly real for Oberleutnant Lange and the Mistral formation. The Mistral composite, due to its unwieldy nature, had to fly a low-altitude route, hugging the landscape for camouflage, slowly climbing only when necessary to clear geographical features. They were flying under radio silence, relying on ground reports that were increasingly delayed and inaccurate due to Allied interdiction. Lange's heart hammered against his chest. Inside the cramped cockpit of the Bf-109, the noise was deafening. He could feel the drag of the Ju-88 below, a constant, heavy reminder of the fate of the warhead he piloted. He was a bomber pilot, forced into the role of a precision missile guide. Row 9:15 a.m. Altitude 3,500 meters, southwest of Rouen. Lange received a frantic, coded transmission from a ground observer unit. Feindjäger gesichtet, hohe Geschwindigkeit, Sektor Delta 4. Enemy fighters sighted, high speed, Sector Delta 4. The Mistral pilots had trained for this scenario, a slow, protective turn into cloud cover, followed by an immediate jettison of the bomb if they were cornered. But the clouds were thin, patchy, and the enemy was not just sighted. High above them, Preddy saw the flash. Not the sunlight glinting off a traditional formation, but a strange double-winged reflection. Something massive, slow and unnatural, climbing cautiously out of the haze. Preddy banked his Mustang hard, the Merlin engine screaming its approval. He dropped his external fuel tanks, lightening the aircraft for the fight. "Tally-ho! I've got a couple of what look like a Junkers tied to a Messerschmitt. Repeat, tied. Let's go see what that damn thing is," he radioed, his voice calm, almost bored. The Mistral crew had trained for a suicidal dive onto an inanimate target. They were about to be shocked, their grim mission interrupted by the ultimate expression of the technological superiority they were fighting against. Their planned sacrificial act was about to become a technological, terrifying ambush. The first Mistral crew to see the P-51s were the wingmen flanking Lange's aircraft. The Americans were coming in from above and behind, using their speed advantage not just to close the distance, but to completely obliterate the calculus of the fight. The speed differential was paralyzing. The Mistral formation was cruising around $450 ex dollars. The P-51s were diving at over $650 ex dollars. This meant Preddy's flight had only seconds to execute the perfect pass. They were targeting the most vulnerable area, the fragile coupling mechanism, and the engine nacelles of the lower Ju-88. Langer saw the dark, aggressive profile of the Mustang. Not the graceful machine he'd seen in recognition photos, but a shape of pure, lethal purpose. He could clearly make out the skull and scythe emblem painted near the cockpit, the legendary Grim Reaper. The ironic realization struck him like a physical blow. They weren't merely interceptors. They were here to harvest. First pass. Seconds from impact. Preddy, leading the charge, aimed for the trailing Mistral. He pressed the firing button. 6 50-caliber machine guns, a torrent of steel and death, erupted, striking the lower Ju-88 wing root and the joint where the two aircraft connected. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The heavy-caliber rounds shredded the aluminum, slicing through fuel lines and control wires. The Ju-88 pilot, whose cockpit was now a solid block of explosives, was technically unmanned, but the pilot in the 109 above suddenly felt the whole apparatus shudder violently. The strut assembly connecting the two planes was damaged, creating uncontrolled torsion. The trailing Mistral began to spiral. The pilot in the upper 109, acting on sheer training instinct, pulled the detachment lever. But the system was already compromised. The explosive bolts fired only partially. The Ju-88 separated only on one side, leaving it tethered to the 109 on the other, spinning wildly like a deadly uncontrolled pendulum. The enormous warhead, unstable, detonated prematurely in a blinding thermal flash that momentarily eclipsed the sun, vaporizing both planes and leaving only a massive, angry black cloud rising from the French countryside. Preddy banked hard, avoiding the explosive debris. He had never seen anything like it. "Did you see that? It just blew itself apart," he yelled into his radio, his calm demeanor briefly shattered by the sheer violence of the explosion. Lang was frozen for a crucial second. His wingman was gone, swallowed by a self-inflicted inferno. He knew he had to jettison immediately and escape. But the psychological barrier was immense. The training was to jettison only over the target. Jettisoning now meant failure, a wasted technological marvel, a broken oath to the Reich. This hesitation was a fatal error. The second wave of Grim Reapers, led by Major John J. Vollmer, was already in position. They had witnessed the first explosion and realized the secret: hit the bottom half, and the top pilot is forced to jettison an unstable charge or die with it. Vollmer's attack was focused, surgical. He peppered the engine housing of Langer's Ju-88. The massive engines of the Mistral pair coughed, and finally died, leaving Langer with a silent 14-ton glider loaded with high explosives. He pulled the detachment lever. The bolts fired clean and hard. The lower Ju-88 dropped away, instantly lighter. Langer pulled the stick back, forcing the now underpowered Bf-109 into a dive for speed, hoping to flee the engagement and glide to a friendly field. The Ju-88, now an unmanned bomb, drifted downwards, its automatic controls still fighting to keep it level before crashing into a farmer's field, narrowly missing a small village. Its massive warhead remained stable, unexploded, a terrifying testament to the power that had just been wasted. But the ordeal was not over. Langer had escaped the death pact, but he was still alone in a heavily used air sector, facing the most lethal fighters in the sky. His Messerschmitt was low on fuel from the long-range cruise, its instruments rattled by the detachment shock. Preddy saw the lone, fleeing Messerschmitt. The Grim Reaper's primary mission was to destroy the enemy, not to capture. Langer, looking over his shoulder, saw the sleek shape of the P-51 closing fast, its 6 muzzles spitting fire. He wasn't shot down by a glorious dogfight. He was ambushed by technological dominance and industrial scale. His suicidal mission had been interrupted by a far more terrifying professional brand of death. He had trained to make the ultimate sacrifice. But the Grim Reapers ensured his sacrifice was futile, his weapon a failure, his final moments overshadowed by their cold, methodical superiority. Oberleutnant Langer's war ended in a shattered cockpit in a muddy field, far short of the Pont de la Roche-Guyon. He survived, captured by a Canadian patrol who were stunned to find a pilot who had just detached himself from a giant high-explosive glider. His fate, capture and interrogation, was perhaps a greater personal humiliation than a glorious end. The clash between the Mistral and the 352nd Fighter Group was more than just a brief skirmish. It was a microcosm of the entire air war's endgame. It proved that technological desperation could not overcome air supremacy. The Mistral program, though initially kept secret, continued to launch sporadic, high-risk missions, achieving minor successes, notably against bridges in Poland and key naval targets in the Baltic. However, its strategic impact was negligible. The cost in specialized crews, aircraft resources, and industrial effort was enormous, yielding results that paled in comparison to the sustained destructive power of a single Allied bomber raid. The Mistral crews, in their own way, represented the German version of the fanatical sacrifice seen in the Pacific. They were pilots convinced that a single spectacular blow could turn the tide. They were willing to face death to achieve that impact. Yet, they were shocked because they faced the reality of modern war. A highly organized, professional, technologically superior air force that took away their choice. They trained for a self-directed, calculated end, but were instead met by the cold, indifferent hand of the Grim Reapers, who ensured their mission failed before it even began. It wasn't glorious death they met, but technological futility. The 352nd Fighter Group, the Grim Reapers, continued their reign of terror until VE Day. Their final tally was astonishing. They were credited with 708 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground, making them one of the highest-scoring P-51 groups of the war. Major George Preddy, the pilot who led the initial intercept, went on to become the highest-scoring active American ace killed in the European theater, a grim, final irony for the unit named after death. The ultimate legacy of the Mistral program is a chilling insight into the mentality of a cornered power. It foreshadowed the evolution of modern missile warfare, a pilotless weapon guided by technology. But in 1944, it was an expensive, fragile bridge between outdated concepts and the jet age, a weapon that asked too much of its crews and the limited industrial capacity that remained. The true victory in the sky was not won by one spectacular weapon, but by the relentless, overwhelming production lines of Detroit and Los Angeles, and the highly trained, aggressive pilots like the Grim Reapers, who translated that industrial might into total air dominance. The Japanese Kamikaze crews trained for a suicidal dive, hoping for a final, glorious collision with the enemy's heart. The Mistral crews faced a similar psychological burden in Europe. But what shocked them was not the act of their own sacrifice, but the ruthless speed and efficiency of the American war machine, which turned their intended final blow into a technological footnote and their sacrifice into a preventable, unceremonious crash. The story of the Mistral is the story of the death pact, not between pilots and their nation, but between an old technological order and the new, unforgiving reality of total air power. The Grim Reapers simply arrived to collect the debts owed by a failing war machine. The war ended not with a single dramatic explosion of a superweapon, but with the quiet hum of countless Merlin engines flying home, their mission complete. The skies of World War II are filled with incredible stories of technological genius and human courage that defined the future of warfare. If you found this historical deep dive into the Death Pact and the Grim Reapers compelling, share this video with fellow history enthusiasts. What other forgotten missions or technological gambles of Wabitufi should we explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments below.